Just to feel them, its mastery.
Okay, well, thank you for the presentation, Stefania. I really enjoyed it, and really, your work really helps me to think about this connection between work and ecology. And one question I had when I listened to you now is about the jobs versus environment dilemma, because it's something, as I said, like this is like the basis in environmental labor studies. And for my PhD research, I now started to look into the history of German unions and found a very mixed picture. So basically, since the 70s, of course, they often position themselves against environmental questions, but there's also always forces who position themselves in favor of environmental protection. And I was thinking that maybe it's also useful to think about this relationship as contested, but as from the very beginning. And I was wondering what you think about that, and also how this mobilization of the dilemma of jobs versus environment is really also something that is helpful for like forces of the status quo, so to speak, so that it's also just an over-mobilized narrative because it kind of is agreeable across the board if you're interested in maintaining things as they are. So that's my question. And the last little thing, if you're interested in communes and how they are not to be romanticized, I find Switzerland a super interesting case. You're probably already aware of that. But yeah.
Which one?
Switzerland, because in Switzerland, the Alpine regions are often actually managed in like some form of Allmende, so in a cooperative form, but it's extremely exclusive for women. So usually only men can become the person who is in charge of that. And it's a quite interesting history, that's still happening today.
Thank you. What's your name?
My name is Katharina. Katharina.
Thank you, Katharina.
Thank you for the useful presentation. I have two last, not big question, but relating the theoretical point of view on the ground on two most different empirical cases. The first, in some scholars, some journalists read the peace of struggle on India as a contamination on productive, reproductive site, and also on bringing scholars into the debate. That was the question on after your presentation, and they have imagined the life from the ground of land that was just an open question and was debated and. You see that this framework that you established can fit as an ecological, environmental, labor struggle and assemblage of forces into ecological question. And the second side, that is the most different, is from GKPN side. They problematize how we produce, what we produce, for who, for the just transition, but there is no just transition because territories, value chain, logistics, and all things related, and also the assemblage of forces, environmental movements, the reproductive side with because you have to take care of your factory, and also with the other question that was posed on the scholars that go to the factory and try to link the gap and engage with the environmental struggles and labor struggles. So maybe I'm a bit confused by these questions, but thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Then you, yeah.
Thank you very much, Stefania. I wanted to ask two things. The first one is how do you think that occupational health could bridge the gap between productive labor and reproductive labor? Because if you are a person working only in reproductive labor, you are not, you don't have any kind of tutela, sorry, I don't remember the word in English, protection. And I think that it could be as the salary also a political point of view for a struggle, not to have protection also for occupational health in domestic work. Other question is what do you think about the role of work organization and the new form of work organization like the one of Amazon or just in time, how they affect also productive labor and reproductive labor? Because if you have to work with this speed, with this task, with this loss of autonomy, this reflects also in your reproductive labor, no? And so, how do you think that labor process and work organization could be seen as a kind of toxicity and harmfulness typical of our present? So that's it. Thank you.
You don't necessarily need to make questions, also because I won't have the time to answer all the questions. You can make comments or, you know, say whatever you have to say. Don't make the effort of turning it into a question, okay? Also because I don't necessarily have the answers.
Well, I was going to say that I have a comment, but it's actually more of a question. So
Usually it's the opposite.
So I was wondering how you think about jobs abolition in connection to the abolition of fossil jobs, for instance. Because with what you outlined, there's a very positive narrative that's possible with all of them. This is the labor that sustains human life, that sustains human metabolism with non-human ecologies in a way that's not disruptive. And how do we transition from harmful jobs to others? But there are also industries that have to be shut down, quite simply. And one example is coal mining jobs, where I have friends who are in Ende Gelände, who have gotten into fistfights with local communities that they tried to talk to them and said, this is our livelihood, and this is our culture here, this is what we're doing. So there's a kind of, there's a lot of potential for reaction, which is of course used by certain political actors and by capital. So how do we think about abolition? So now I'm going to try and just make it as a comment rather than a question. I think, so one anecdote is I gave a presentation for a service sector union in Brussels, talking about what I call bachelor jobs. We can call it other things, but this is what I call it in this context, which is jobs that are so insane that you have to undermine the conditions of life in order to make a living, right? How do we get beyond this? And the response from the service sector union, people, including the head of the trade union, was to embrace that because they don't feel that they're doing that kind of job. And they accepted the provocation, which I found was interesting, that unions who are defending those kinds of jobs are doing a kind of scattering against the condition of the working class more broadly. And I was very surprised, but obviously it's not that easy. And within the trade union context, there's an idea that you have to maintain unity between the different trade unions, and you have to maintain a division of labor so that the unions who have a stake in a certain industry are the ones who get to speak about the future of that industry, about industrial policy, about everything. So what do we say? Like, how do we relate to these contradictions? Do we say that there are some workers who are simply our enemies, frankly? Or do we find ways to break their attachments to work, to that kind of work? Even given the timelines, possibly in the absence of the offer of other good jobs for them. The retraining, like that's a real dilemma because there's a time pressure where we can only do that once we've gained a certain kind of political power to offer them retraining opportunities to change industrial policy and so on. How do we do that? Sorry, that was a question.
Good question.
Just another one from here, and then just give the floor also to people from the room and then we gave you, okay?
Hi, thanks for your talk. What I find problematic in your presentation is I think that your definition of work without, so the idea that after all productive and reproductive work can be, or labor can be actually seen as one concept. I think that there are some problems. For example, how do we consider one historic key demand of the feminist movement, that is the access to paid work for the women who want to do it, so for so access to employment. So it's don't you think that in this way you can this demand becomes more becomes less relevant, and also isn't too much if we also speak of work by non-humans or by nature. So yes, I mean obviously nature does something useful for us, but it's I think very difficult to see it as similar to that of human workers. And in which sense can we say that nature is or is exploited? I think that it's a bit problematic to use the same concept for pursue different things. Thank you.
What's your name? Sorry, I couldn't hear.
My name, yes, my name is Ruggero.
Thank you.
Much. Just to, hello. Sheila, you can unmute yourself.
Yes, hi, thank you very much for your presentation, Stefania. Your presentation in your texts reminded me about the Moish Poston understanding of work, as he rejects an ontology of the work and he understands work as a historical category, despite usually being treated as a trans historical element. So I would like to know if you engage with this understanding. And my second question, perhaps it's a very broad question, but still, where to put North-South dependency relations into this political ecology analysis of labor? I mean, understanding that reconfiguring labor requires taking this aspect into account. For example, when analyzing social justice movements or the just transition agenda, would you be able to give some comments on how left-wing radical movements, politicians, or scientists are thinking or practicing international alliance, for example, thinking about the ways to advance toward a social ecological justice agenda that does not benefit from exploitation or dispossession in other places outside the global north?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, we can be back in the room here, physical room. Yeah.
Hey, thank you so much, Ursula, for the talk. It was very interesting. First, I was thinking, I was very, glad with the sum up of the presentation, with coming with the three ecological subjectivities of labor. And it really reminded me of these three categories of Jason Moore, who has, he called them like proletariat, which would be the synonym of your like climate jobs, then the femitariat, which is kind of the care income demand, and then biotariat, so the people who are already like threatened by the capital. So I was wondering if you got influenced by his work, or how does it like overlap? Then the second question is about the unions, and basically also going to worlds with hopefully less production, whether you had hope for unions getting rid of this eco-modernist mindset, if there are some examples, like kind of good examples that we could be building on. And then the third question was regarding the kind of, I think what you're doing in your work is a lot about like reframing work and what we mean by it. And I guess the other trend, maybe also within the degrowth movement, is actually decentering the idea of work as such and talking about post-work, which I don't know, I think there are like some, it can go against each other, and especially this idea of like working less in a degrowth future, and it being socially just and not exploiting global south, etc. So I'm wondering whether you've given this, whether it's like a strategic decision to reframe work rather than talk about post-work. And then the fourth, more of a comment, especially coming from this like feminist perspective of the, and I don't know how much it is theorized, but the kind of masculinity connected to those kind of jobs that we need to get rid of. So, for example, talking about automobile sector, beef sector, fossil fuel sector. These are all kinds of jobs that are mostly like male dominated, and I guess going towards a future which has work redefined and mostly being looked at as care work would pose a big threat to the subjectivity and identity that I think is at the very root of. So I'm wondering whether in the coming books there will be more about masculinity and eco-masculinity as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And your name? Your name?
Tadeusz.
Tadeusz.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Tadeusz.
Yeah.
I was trying to hire it, and thank you very much. I also enjoyed it very much. I've read it many times already. I don't know if you're familiar with Bigger Haug's 4-in-1 perspective. I was just wondering, I really like this approach, and also kind of recognizing these 4 categories all as a word. I've been thinking lately, and after your presentation, I caught myself thinking again about if you would consider this as a rather, this global north narrative, and when we're talking about peasant feminism and so on, like how would you approach them? And isn't that such an elitist project in a way too, that can be only implemented in the countries where where there is enough space and opportunities to, I don't know, to do learn guitar or read poetry or whatever, to political work, which is maybe not in all cases possible also because of conditions.
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
No, basically, if we consider this 4-in-1, that it's political work, it's like the self-development, then it's the care work, and then it's the wage labor. Like, would you consider this as a rather global north approach of how to distribute it equally within the society, or is it also, would you consider it also possible or doable or wishful for very first?
With the house categorization.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's fine. Yes. I didn't see other people. Yes, thank you, Stefania. Just to verbalize publicly what we are discussing during the debate. So my question is, let's put it this way, not only you, but other people are trying to expand the category of work to much beyond, let's say, the traditional understanding of work as something specific of humans. So when you speak about non-human work, the question is what is work? How we define now work? And so the question is how do you feel the extent to which it is convenient to stretch the notion of work, and at which point it becomes counterproductive because it loses explanatory or analytical capacity. So it's a matter of, I think, of balancing different things. I'm not very close to know your opinion because I'm also not sure at all where the limit should be of the user category of work.
Thank you. Yes, Richard. Please, for those that are following the session at home, raise the hand if you want to comment or ask.
So thank you very much, Stefan. It was really interesting as always. So I have a question about not so much the concept of work that you use, but rather of the working class. Because of course, amplifying the focus and the definition of labor also means to amplify the what we mean by working class, as your presentation has already shown. But at times, my question is, do you think that the working class would be kind of definable analytically, or is it dependent on a process of subjectification? It wasn't really clear to me from your presentation whether you think of it as something that exists in itself, let's say it like this, or whether it's something that needs to be made. As it also, these boundaries with the master position are always very blurry, as you were also showing. For example, there are master positions within the working class. So just a clarification, if you can, on that. A second question or comment, or at least thought, is about the way in which consumption comes into work, like, for example, reproductive work. So what does it mean to carry out reproductive work through and with the commodities that are produced by waged labor, and how this nexus can be conceived as part of, I would say, the colonization of commodities by commodities of everyday life. One point that came to my mind as you were presenting, but that I think you have already clarified, is about the green jobs, climate jobs, the issue that is, what I was thinking is, can it be co-opted actually and subsumed by capitalist relations? And you already also said that you think of a process of transformation as part of the three subjectivities together, so not one without the other, which I think clarifies the whole thing. And one last point, it was about when you were talking about care income, you were saying that, which of course it's a very important campaign and movement, but you were saying, access to payment, to being paid to money for the labor as part of a process of emancipation of reproductive labor and freeing up from exploitative relations. And of course, I see the point in somehow giving value to something that is devalued as part of giving also autonomy to that kind of sphere. But at the same time, I guess that is not all. Somehow that also a change in the very social and cultural relationships is needed. As for example, as women got into the paid labor force, actually, as we all know,
the amount of labor that they carry out every day as augmented instead of diminishing. So just maybe a clarification about that. And I think I'm finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
The time.
Yes. Yes. We are just collecting tons of comments.
No, this one, as invited, this is not a question. Actually, I think I'm gonna have a seat. No, but then I'm not able to see you. No, thank you, Stefania. No. Okay. Thank you, Stefania, and thank you also to the discussants. And the chair. Yeah, no, so I think I was going to, say, I think you are on the right track with this, idea of gendering the commons and problematizing a bit this aspect. I think this is something that is already being pretty invited pretty explicitly also from the practices in, for instance, both, I wouldn't even distinguish between rural and urban in this case. Like I have personally experienced this both in situations where there's mixed gender commoning projects where this issue emerges, where there's work, there is also productive work, for instance, in agrarian settings. The question of gender emerges pretty evidently and leads to also a lot of attempts to reconfigure, so having non-mixed spaces, and having policies that regulate the distribution of labor. But this is not, of course, an easy one to manage, especially in self-organized spaces where the kind of pressures and the overwhelming dimension of the struggle is very determinant. But for instance, there's also, I think also in Naples, there's quite exciting experiences of mixed commoning projects. So that may be an interesting one in case you haven't yet. There's more projects popping up actually at the moment. Then to this regard, there is something more anecdotal, even more anecdotal, that's been invited a bit from different comments, like Paul was referring to the cows in the cow slide. Someone mentioned Switzerland and alpage, the alpine pastoral management as forms of commoning that is, of course, brought forward, reproduced in a very conservative kind of society. But actually, it's also a kind of practice that is currently striving to be reproduced. I personally, I have worked together with my partner for 3 years, for 3 summers in the Vallese. So there's some people who come from Lausanne, some people who come from the Val d'Ossola here. And there, especially, we were shepherding cows that are bred, used to be being bred, not like breeding tradition for both milk and for both dairy and meat. And then, of course, as this production tends to specialize, has been more just for meat, because also these farmers tend to not milk them anymore and have other jobs in factories or services. These were mostly male communities of farmers operating and bringing their cows up grazing. And what we had to do, they were being bred more for their tendency to fight. They are, all animals fight to reassess hierarchies and so on. But they were particularly being bred for, how good they were at fighting. So our job as shepherds was to register the hierarchies and attend to the cows on the field and see who was winning most fights and intervene when there were a third cow joining the fight. And so these farmers were always calling us and coming up only once in a while. So has my cow won? How's my cow fighting? Is my cow fighting at all? And oftentimes our farmers were very disappointed that their cow was not that great fighter. what happened is
But
that
why?
there's something we witnessed.
Extra value into this fighting.
No, I think there's some gambling going on with the farmers.
Yeah, that's what I'm.
But I don't know. But and there is some spectacles of cow fights, but that scene is quite small. No, what happened is that when the farmer came up to visit their cow, started fighting more. And we saw this, and that was a kind of work in a way that the animal was performing. And I really wonder what kind of work that was. and how you can expand on that, yeah. That's about it.
Thanks for the talk. Very example. No, I was just very inspired by the last comment, so I just wanted to add along and have a say in that. No, because I was wondering about the concept of common and oh yeah, premise. This is not really a question. It's sort of like a hybrid question comment that doesn't mind.
I can relax.
Yeah, so lay back and relax. No, but what I was thinking is also sort of like the role of nature in defining common. I'm working with farmers in the mountains, and I really see how in their practices of their labor is in fact defined by the specificity of the territory and defined by the specificity of nature. So, for instance, in the mountains, there's a lot of rewilding. Well, in Italian is deterioramento rather than rewilding, that has a negative connotation. But anyways, so a lot of wild animals are coming, and that is changing their practices, and that is also changing the way they produce the commons and enjoy also the commons. So, for instance, they have to put the electric fences around the fields. So, in a way, nature as itself, and we could also the example of climate change. Nature as itself is imposing somewhat of a limitation that emerges from the essence of nature, from the autonomy of nature, is imposing somewhat of a limitation on humans' labor and human action. And I think that this has, in a way, then a lot of potential when creating forms of value. Like, in a way, nature is producing this form of value of the territory, and I think that then. When we're considering commoning, then I think there's a room for considering the role of nature in this production as really being more active, not in a way, yeah, I guess you could call it as having somewhat of an agency, but then I guess then you fall into a whole different debate. But I really like, for instance, the concept of limit that we read for Luigi's paper as really acknowledging, respecting, and so also in the logic of care, the limit that nature imposes. Yeah, as I said, this is not really a question, so I'm just going to drop it here.
Okay. Seems that no one wants to add something, neither online. Maybe just a comment, another one from me about comments. Yeah, commons. Why we expect that commons have to be gender equal or something like that? Commons, as Elinor Ostrom intended it, was basically alternative to market. That's it. So why, let's try to avoid the essentialism that we have on gender with organization or arrangement systems, because sometimes we expect too much from this kind of alternatives. Yeah.
My turn?
I don't have the courage to say, but
I have to go. Bye. Well, first of all, many thanks for all the wonderful comments that all of you have given. Starting with you, Dario, and Paul, and everyone else. So what to do now? I was trying to see patterns across the comments and recurrent questions or themes that might, but honestly, I failed because that would require me to reread all the questions. So I'll just go one by one. So, and so let me start with your comments, Dario. Of course, I want to reply to all of them, but the economy as provision, of course, it's provisioning is a key concept in feminist economics, as well. So yeah, the idea of reconceptualizing the economy in terms of provision rather than allocation of scarce resources, blah blah. And it's interesting the way you put it, that there is a necessary work that becomes visible only when it's not available. I mean, yeah, of course, that is the whole point with feminist economics is to make this work visible, and it's been doing it for 5 decades now. The point is, if feminist economics remains a separated field, or if it really starts influencing, mainstream economic discourse. And this is a challenge, of course, because once you dialogue with beyond the protected field of the feminist economics, you run all the risks of your concepts that perhaps were radical being co-opted into mainstream economic discourse on growth. And feminist economics in itself is not degrowth oriented necessarily, or even necessarily anti-capitalist. There are different also approaches in feminist economics. So, I mean, this could be a very long conversation, but I just wanted to acknowledge this because I myself feel like part of this struggle, between keeping your work confined within certain safe boundaries where you feel that that you can be true to yourself, and also condemn it to be irrelevant, socially speaking. And this is not just about feminist economics. I think it applies to many of the things that we were talking about. The issue of environmental labor politics, and the political ecology of labor. So I think that this is a broader theme here. Is or even commenting, how far can we really bring these radical concepts into the politics of changing mainstream concepts, of the politics of influencing social change as well, starting from knowledge, starting from academic work, but also influencing social movements and then influencing civil society at large by bringing in the concepts that then can easily get de-radicalized and become really functional to business as usual. So this is sounds very abstract, but I think that maybe if I can give you some examples linking to some of the questions that Paul, for example, was asking about. I think it was about the eco-modernism. So if the question was if we are, considering what labor environmentalism, giving it to a meaning beyond what it's really, how really its real potentialities. Let's say, no, if I understand. And here again, I think one useful concept that's also used in environmental labor studies is the concept of revolutionary reform, in the sense that the challenge here is to think of political strategies that are geared around real demands and real needs. That the real labor movement is asking, and the real people in certain social positions can identify with. No? And from there, building demands that are radical enough to potentially make for a bigger change, no? For bigger changes. And I want to give one example that I know a little bit because I've been working on it, as you know, for the past 2 years, and it's the care income demand. Because what attracts me from the care income demand is the fact that it's not academic discourse. It comes from the wages for housework movement. Was never an academic thing. It was a movement of Black working class women back in the early 70s, in a specific historical moment in which they were losing the rights they had gained in the previous era. No? And they were losing access to money that had been acknowledged to them for their caregiving work and for being single mothers, or for being single working class mothers, and for being single working class Black mothers. So they had gained access to money in order to have some recognition of their work, but also as a means of subsistence and of raising their children, not losing their children to the state. No? So these were the real demands that these women had. And then it also became intellectual endeavor, and the movement started talking about Marxism and Marxist work, and how it should be criticized, starting from this real social demands coming from real subjects, no? And so, to me, this means that to me this is interesting, because then the whole feminist political economy and feminist movement took a different turn, rejecting the money claim, no, as a commodification of labor, and also these buzzwords came into, I think that most of the women in the wages for housework and now global women's strike movement, if you tell them commodification, they say don't, please, no. So, because it's not understandable why a person, a nurse who has a paid job, or a teacher who has a paid job must be paid to do exactly the same things that I do in my house without being paid. And why do you call that a job and dignify it? And why do you call mine whatever, no, an activity? And so, to me, what is really radical there, it's a claim to equality. This is an equality claim. This is how I see it. And I come to Alicia's question here, because it's also scandalous. If we want to use Ranciere's approach. No, it's a scandal because the scandal is that of putting caregiving work that has been performed for centuries for free, putting it on same equal footing with paid jobs that are considered valuable. And this is a scandal. To many people, it sounds like really, to many caregivers themselves, no? It's not because we have been educated for centuries into this patriarchal value system that calls it love or whatever, no? And so we ourselves have been educated, and this recalls something that you were also mentioning, Dario, before. Why wouldn't the women themselves recognize that the struggle? But of course, I mean, the patriarchal system has been carried along by women all over the century. I mean, of course, if patriarchy would have ended very soon, if it weren't women themselves who internalized it and in the position of subaltern subjects, of course, but reproducing that, no, supporting, reproducing. Also, interestingly enough, in some cases, there's this interesting dialectic that it's also being analyzed in subaltern studies. No, how the subaltern subject somehow tends to appropriate the colonizing subject and manipulate it in its own interest, no? Somehow, so there are always these dialectics. This doesn't mean that there is inequality, and it is a value system that supports and reproduces this inequality. So it's not to be expected that women perform as emancipatory subject only by being women. It doesn't mean that you are an emancipatory subject in itself. So the question of the non-human labor, this is a very interesting, I mean, some very interesting comments have been made on this. And it's also a relatively new subject for me. What I find interesting here is the attempt, for example, by Elisa Battistoni, an attempt to give this this subject of non-human subjectivity or agency, if you want, of non-human work, to see it not only to see it, to talk about it in materialist terms, no, always referring this to some system of production system, and also some system of value extraction from this kind of law, and not talk about it just in ontological terms without, referring to how this non-human labor is related to human labor. What interests me is the connection between human and non-human labor. So how human labor itself, as we saw in the last intervention, human labor itself is redefined in different ways of relating to non-human, and relating to non-human labor can go via the commons. For example, in my book, one of the inspiring story of the book, it's about a couple of peasant workers in the Amazon who were actually practicing a form of agroforestry conservation in the commons. And my big inspiring part of the story is to see how they were relating to other species, to the chestnut trees in particular, because they were living in an area of Brazil nuts, and how to this relating to the species in a non-objectifying way. because to them this species was not a source of money. But was the a companion species, we could call it, no? Borrowing from Donald Haraway. It was really a companion species with which they made their living, no? And so this is how they saw it, like, yeah, a relationship and paritarian and the equal relation, work relation that they have. So there is this possibility, and there are other possibilities of relating to non-human work, like, for example, the example that you were giving, Paul, of the mechanized milk production, or seeing non-humans as in an objectifying them, no, as producers of money in the end. So I think that that's interesting that one of the questions was about how can this relationship with non-human work translate in terms of political organizing. Sorry, I don't remember who did that question, but I think it's very interesting. And yeah, this is what I'm also interested in, is to understand, because this translates into how can the labor movement, broadly intended, workers' organizations incorporate and not only ally with, for example, animal rights movements, or the ecological movement, what it calls itself the ecological movement, which is generally a white middle class ecological movement, not to disqualify it, but just to say it's not the only one, no? It tends to see itself as the ecological movement, but it's only one part of it. But it's not just a matter of alliances, but it's also how these transformations also of work could reflect into a different ecological class consciousness. No? How people who work can get to change their ecological consciousness, also based on the changes in the work they do, and these changes very often reflect incorporation of non-human work. So this would probably lead to change ecological consciousness. The point is that, of course, much depends whether this relationship with non-human work happens under in which kind of property and labor regime, no, this happens. So if it happens in a commons context, it gives some results. If it happens in a factory under capitalist labor relations, it can turn into very inhumane forms of relating to non-human work, as it happens, for example, in meat production, no? Yeah, so of course the context where the relationship takes place is fundamental. I mean, there are a lot of more questions. I don't know, maybe I could touch upon Jason Moore's tripartite categorization of proletarians, femitarians, biotarians. I don't like it at all. I mean, all my point is to say that these are not fixed identities. They cannot be seen as fixed identities, and so just to mention one, women or women historically domesticated into unpaid caregiving work are not just feminist. I mean, they do not just give rise to feminist claims. They are also proletarians, as I was saying before, in the sense of being dependent on the wage, so only dependent indirectly on someone else's wage or on someone else's property. And so, and also their claims are about their autonomy and control over their bodies. So it's also a biotarian struggle, no, in this sense. So I don't think there is any, I mean, categorizations are always risky, and I'm aware, and I also proposed one. But I think what is more useful is to identify types of struggles, and then these different types of struggles or agency, no, or subject of political subjectivity, they try to understand how they are related to each other. And this is what I was trying to do when I was problematizing, no, the fact that these struggles, I told you these struggles, these different subjectivities are not necessarily allied, are not necessarily compatible. They might also be contradictions with each other, but they are also embodied in sometimes, very often, they are also embodied in the same subjects, no? The same persons in different moments of their lives or in different contexts. So it's messy, but we should avoid the temptation of creating categories of people. I mean, categories are categories of agency, but people do not neatly fit in any of them. For example, the category of labor environmentalists, no? The subjectivity of the first kind of subjectivity, the climate jobs campaign, etc. Clearly, as many of you also have pointed out, clearly there are different tensions within that, and there are those who really see the climate jobs as something very instrumental, so that we can survive in this transition and get more jobs, or at least replace the jobs that we are losing. No, ideally we would keep our jobs. No, there are those who think like that. And ideally, in one of the articles that I think I circulated to you is the one on just transition that I quoted with Irina Veliku. We quote claim about how can, in absence of any alternative to mining, how can a miner desire anything else, anything rather than mining? So this is the principle now that somehow it goes with for the miner, it goes for the woman who sees herself as she can only be a mother and a housemaker, a homemaker. No, there's a matter of social imaginaries that are not always there, no, and usually are actually go in the opposite direction and do not favor these different desires, no, because that's what we are talking about here. I don't think we can talk of labor's agency climate agency in normative terms. So we have to talk about it in terms of in erotic terms, if you want, in terms of desiring a different kind of world. Because until we see workers as the conservatives, those that only desire to keep the world as it is, I mean, this is very limiting, no? So the problem is how can actually we make possible, we in the sense that it's not like we who decide this. It's not our choice, our decision, but we can choose of thinking of climate politics in terms of desire and possibilities for desiring different worlds. And this changes, I think, a little bit our perspective. I don't know, it's 6:20, so maybe I should stop here. Yeah, I don't know.
There is a rise at them online, but I think that it was the previous end of Priscilla. Yeah. So.
Okay, so we stop here. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Now we have to
Since I have some signature missing, I want to be sure that those who decide mean that they want to go to the evening tower or something else. So Pietro Torino is coming or not? No.
No, è firmato l'altro poi.
Diana? You are not coming, okay. No?
Great.
At least, yes, at least I'm sure. Then Marco.
Also, I have a last one. We are trying to create a Telegram group, and I'm creating a link, and I just post it on the Facebook wall so that everyone can access it and just see it.
And then Lydia. Lydia. She's not.
She's not.
Okay, so. Okay. Anyway, one or more or less. Okay, thank you very much. So tomorrow morning, remember to come here at 8:30. Otherwise, I come to phone you. Enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Salve.